They no longer asked when the bread would arrive. They didn't crave sweets or beg for tales. They just sat close by the fire, eyes fixed ahead, wrapped in silence. They had learned how to wait. Outside, the village had gone still. Neighbors no longer lingered in the lanes. No shouting over grazing sheep. No gossip traded at the well. Just the occasional snap of frozen wood or the distant rasping cough of someone too tired to cover their mouth. Famine didn't turn people cruel. It made them quiet. Occasionally, someone would return from the woods with a rabbit, a small bird, or a few bitter acorns soaked and ground into something chewable. You smiled while chewing, not because it tasted good, it never did, but because it was something. You trained yourself not to resent the manner. Sometimes they offered grain, more often they didn't. The steward appeared less often now, a blessing, because he wasn't there to collect dues, a curse, because he wasn't there to offer help. His silence spoke louder than any decree. The church tried, loaves after mass, alms for the weakest, but they too had stretched beyond their means. You found yourself praying more, not from belief, but from repetition, because when your hands can no longer grip a hoe or cradle a child, they still remember how to fold together in supplication. Some villagers left, searching for work, food, salvation, anything. Some came back, some didn't. You never asked where they'd been. You didn't have the strength to care. Hunger changed the body. You felt your ribs not with your hands, but from inside, like your bones were pressing outward against skin too thin to hold them. You rose more slowly each day. You bruised from a simple touch. You woke with clenched fists, fingers curled as though still holding a spade, a pan, a bundle of twigs you could no longer afford to burn. And the cold, God, the cold, seeped into your joints like ink into linen. The fire became your most faithful companion. You sat with it, slept beside it, fed it while starving yourself. It gave you the one thing nothing else could, warmth. By now, you'd eaten everything that could be eaten. The roots, the bitter weeds, the shriveled beans, the gray-streaked flour. You'd boiled bones 3 times, scraped bark until your nails bent. You'd baked famine bread so hard it cracked your tooth. And when even that was gone, your eyes wandered to things that weren't meant to be food, but could be, if you were desperate enough. Leather, boiled, salted, chewed into submission. Not a meal, not even nourishment. It's something. Once you caught a rat. You didn't scream. You gave thanks. You cooked it in secret and told no one. You still feel shame, but not regret. The dream shifted. You dreamed of feasts, honeyed bread, roasted meat, steaming bowls of broth. You woke up chewing your tongue. You dreamed of boiling pots again and again, though nothing had simmered in days. You dreamed of green things pushing through snow, of lambs toddling beside their mothers, of spring. And some nights, you dreamed of being full. Those were the worst. You always woke in tears. The graveyard filled slowly at first, then faster, then too fast to keep pace. You knew someone had died when the bell didn't toll. It meant there weren't enough hands left to pull the rope. Burials became quick, graves shallow, prayers brief. Mourning turned inward. Everyone carried too much already. You wanted to cry, to mark the loss, but tears cost more than you could spare. So you carried grief like you carried hunger, quietly, and then, like all famines, it faded. Not in a grand, sudden gesture. It faded like mist. Slowly, then all at once. The rain returned. The earth softened. Seeds took root. You watched green shoots reach skyward, frail but alive. And you felt something you hadn't dared to in months. Hope. You rationed the harvest. Children first, then the old. You took the last bowl, smiled through cracked lips. When the first proper loaf rose golden in the oven, you stared before biting in. It tasted of everything you'd lost, and somehow, everything you'd kept. You've never seen the king. You probably never will. But you know his name and say it during prayers, just in case someone is listening, just in case it counts. Out here, tucked against the edges of maps where rivers fade and roads forget where they're going, change rarely knocks politely. And when it does come, it's almost never welcome. Still, your thatch roof mostly keeps out the rain. The walls stand, leaning like tired old men but holding on. The fire hasn't gone out. And tomorrow, the same sky will open above the same hills. That's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but nearly all of them will trace the same routes. From hearth to field, from gate to well, from neighbor's fence to chapel door. Most people you know have never strayed farther than the next village, and even that feels like a journey best reserved for weddings, funerals, or the occasional desperate errand. It's not fear that keeps people close to home. Not entirely. It's the understanding that the world beyond the ridge was never made for you. It belongs to other people, richer people. People who wear boots in winter, people who eat meat without counting the bites. You know the names of every hedge between your cottage and the stream. You know which branch creaks in the wind and which stone turns underfoot. But beyond that, the land becomes story, theory, a place as mythical as heaven and just as far away. You've heard tales from the next village. Who married the miller's daughter? Who broke into the bakehouse? Who said the priest there snores through his homilies? But you've never seen those fields, never heard those sermons. Travel is possible, sure, but possible like lightning is possible, rare, risky, and most often regretted. The roads, if you can call them that, are soft with mud and hard with silence. No signs, no friendly inns, just ruts cut by wagon wheels and the occasional landmark described with a shrug. Keep walking until you see the tree that looks like a crooked finger, then left past the rock shaped like a sleeping pig. It sounds like a joke, but it isn't. There are things to fear out there. The forest is the first, not the kind with trimmed paths and birdsong. Medieval woods are thick, tangled places full of shadows and noises you don't want to identify. Boars, wolves, strangers who haven't seen a friendly face in seasons. If you weren't born in the woods don't want you. Then there are bandits, men and women with nothing to lose and everything to take. If you're walking with purpose, they assume you carry coin. If you're walking alone, they assume you're vulnerable. Both might be true. The law doesn't stretch far beyond village walls. Justice rides slowly, if at all. And then there's the danger of being lost. Not in the romantic sense, just gone. One wrong turn and you disappear. Not even dramatically. Just not there anymore. No one to search, no maps to follow. Your body becomes part of the undergrowth. Your name fades faster than the smoke from your last cook fire. Even if you make it somewhere else, you're not guaranteed welcome. Outsiders bring questions, and sometimes trouble. You speak the same language mostly, but your accent is off. Your customs strange. You hold your spoon differently. These things matter more than you'd think. Food is scarce, even among neighbors. No one has room for strangers. Beds are full, bread is counted. You might find work if you're strong, quiet, and lucky. But luck rarely travels with peasants. It stays home, warming its hands by the familiar hearth. So you stay. You work the land that remembers your grandfather's hands. You tend the animals that know your voice. You fix the same fence every spring, curse the same leak every winter. It's not much, but it's yours. Routine becomes a kind of shelter. You wake with the light. You rest when the sky fades. You eat when you can. You count time not in days or months, but in chores and harvests. A dry year, a wet year. The one where the barley turned black. The one where the apples came in fat and sweet. That's how you remember. The steward visits sometimes, not often. Just enough to remind you that someone else owns your sweat. He carries a list. He asks how much barley you've stored, whether your son is old enough for labor, whether your debts have grown teeth. You answer carefully, not too much detail. Too much detail makes him curious. You don't hate him. You don't fear him either, not exactly. You treat him like a storm. Annoying, inevitable, not worth cursing, because it won't stop the rain. You bow. You say the right words. You pretend not to hope that maybe this year he'll forget you. The church tries to remind you that your suffering is meaningful, that the meek shall inherit something, that the next life will make sense of this one. But heaven feels a long way off when the roof leaks and your boots have holes. Still you nod. You fold your hands. You give thanks. Sometimes out loud. Sometimes only in your head. That still counts. Maybe. Because here, on this thin edge of the kingdom, survival isn't about strength. It's about rhythm, repetition. Knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, when to kneel, when to dig. You keep going. Because someone must. You didn't talk about the night, not openly. But everyone felt it, knew what it carried. The wolves, the rustling of trees with no wind, the thud of hooves you couldn't trace. You slept with one ear open and your boots never too far from your reach. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness, a necessary part of staying alive. Rogues, strangers, the occasional fire sparked by a careless ember, roofs creaking beneath heavy snow, and the things you couldn't name. Spirits, shadows, whispers that didn't belong to wind. You never said the words aloud, not in daylight, not in front of the children, but you placed iron beside the doorway, hung dried herbs, sage, rosemary, rue, over lintels, tied red string around wrists and muttered blessings over straw beds. The rituals didn't guarantee safety. They just made you feel like you'd done something. Sometimes that was enough. Sleep wasn't surrender. It was a calculated risk. So you prepared. Faced the bed toward the fire, never toward the door. Covered mirrors, hid knives under pillows. You didn't undress. You layered. Wool, tunics, cloaks. The very idea of removing clothing for sleep would have made you laugh if you had the energy for laughter. You slept in your boots, sometimes in your belt. The cold didn't creep. It claimed. It slid under doors, through walls, into bones. You learned to share warmth, even if it meant an elbow in your side or a dog's wet nose pressed against your back. The closeness wasn't comfortable, but it was familiar. In it, there was a kind of fragile safety. Someone always mumbled in their sleep. Someone always kicked. Someone's breath rattled like leaves in wind. But that was what a family sounded like. It meant everyone was still there. Dreams mattered. A field of wheat meant good fortune. A snake meant illness. A broken tooth? Death. You listened to your dreams, or you brought them to someone who could listen better. Dream readers existed. Not officially, not sanctioned by the church, but everyone knew who they were. The older woman who knew which herbs to burn. The man who claimed his dreams predicted the frost. The church warned against such things. Said dreams were temptation. Doors the devil slipped through. But even the priest had dreams. You'd seen the look in his eyes after morning mass, when his voice caught on a word. You prayed before bed, not just for safety, but to guard your thoughts, to protect the soul while the body rested. Because the body could fail quietly in the night. A fever could rise without warning. A cough that seemed small could deepen and never lift. And by morning, someone might be missing. So every new day began with quiet assessment. The light returned. The coals were stirred. You opened your eyes and checked the room. Listened for breathing. Counted heads. If everyone stirred, the day began. Water, bread, chickens. If someone didn't, you checked. Touched a shoulder, whispered their name. If they didn't wake, you made the sign of the cross and moved forward. You still had to fetch water. You shared your dreams if they lingered. The good ones were passed around like honey. The bad ones were swallowed, folded into the day and set aside. They didn't disappear. They just became part of the rhythm. Sleep came in shifts. First sleep, a waking hour. Second sleep. You didn't need a clock. You had instinct. You had the rhythm of the fire, of your body, of time passing slowly in the dark. Some people rose during the night to stoke the coals or whisper a prayer. Some used that quiet hour for thought. Others walked outside, breathing in frost and listening to the way the world held its breath. It wasn't restful, but it was real. The ache in your back softened for a moment. The blisters on your hands cooled. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you dreamed of something that didn't scare you. That was the closest thing to peace you got. When a famine came, it wasn't a surprise. You saw it coming. The barley curled too soon. The beans dropped flowers before they bore pods. The rain came late or too heavy. The signs whispered first, then shouted. You looked at the fields and did the math. How many sacks left from last year? How many mouths to feed? How long could you make it stretch? Hope stayed around longer than food. At first, you didn't panic. You remembered past bad years. You told yourself this was another. Maybe the manor had reserves. Maybe the next village fared better. You told stories of the year-old Tom ate boiled nettles and survived. But by late summer, the stew was mostly water, and the children stopped asking for more. That's when you knew. You fed the children first, then the elderly. You took whatever was left. You told your body not to need so much. You counted every bite like coin. You scraped the pot clean and still felt hungry. You told yourself hunger was survivable, that it had edges, that you could move around it. But famine doesn't just empty stomachs. It hollows everything. Your sleep, your temper, your sense of what's fair. You watched people grow quiet, not cruel. Laughter vanished, arguments stopped, even gossip faded. Everyone conserved themselves. And somehow, through all of that, you still tended the fire. Still whispered blessings. Still counted dreams like omens. The church was always there. Not just as a building, but as a presence. Its shadow stretched further than the bell tower, further than the priest's sermon. From your first breath, you belonged to it. Baptized in cold water, marked with a name and a prayer you didn't understand. You were folded into something older than kings and deeper than borders. You didn't question the church's reach. You lived inside it like you lived inside weather. It explained the world when no one else could. Why the barley failed. Why your neighbor's baby didn't wake. Why some men prospered and others broke under the same burden. You were told your suffering had purpose, that pain purified, that the meek would inherit something, though no one could say exactly when. Tithes were expected, a tenth of everything, even if everything was barely enough. Grain, eggs, coin if you had it. The priest always knew what was owed. He didn't ask with cruelty, just with certainty, as if the world would stop turning if the church went unfed. You grumbled, quietly. Everyone did, but you still knelt when the bell rang. Still crossed yourself when thunder rolled. Still whispered Ave Marias into the cracks of your day. Because if the church was wrong, if it didn't matter, then nothing did. And that was too much emptiness to carry. Even when the priest drank too much, you forgave him. Even when the bishop taxed sins like they were wheat, you complied. You watched indulgent sellers roll through with carts full of promises and guilt-shaped tokens, and you bought what you could. Not because you believed in them fully, but because it felt better than doing nothing. Faith wasn't about certainty. It was about motion, about showing up, about lighting a candle even when the flame flickered. You couldn't read the Latin, but you understood the rhythm, the rituals, the comfort in repetition. You knew which saints to pray to for coughs and which ones to ask about lost sheep. You knew that Sunday Mass was less about theology than it was about marking time. Another week survived, another one to begin. The church buried your dead. It rang the bells, it blessed your fields, it named your children, it held you together when everything else frayed. You didn't need it to be perfect. You just needed it to stay. And beneath all the prayers and penance, you held hope. That when your time came, your name would be said aloud. That your sins would be weighed gently. That your suffering would not be wasted. You might think that after everything, after the taxes, the famine, the plagues, the rules carved in Latin and enforced with steel, that peasants would rise up more. That the pressure would build until it cracked the quiet. That one cold dawn, a village would erupt. Sick of kneeling, sick of silence. And sometimes they did. The peasants' revolt in England, the Jacquerie in France, scattered like sparks. A steward's house burned, a tax collector chased down, a banner raised for an hour before the archers arrived. You heard of them. Someone always knew someone who'd seen it, or claimed to. But those moments came and went like storms, quick, loud, then gone. The price was always higher than the hope. Executions, public hangings, entire villages fined or burned. The silence that followed louder than before. You didn't forget, but you didn't repeat. You couldn't afford to. You weren't a coward. You were a survivor. The kind of courage you needed wasn't the kind that lit torches. It was the kind that woke every morning, patched the roof, and carried water again. That raised a child with scraped knuckles and whispered songs in a cracked voice. You fought back in inches, in choices, in the way you endured. The system worked not because it was just, but because it was old. You were born into owed grain, owed labor, owed silence. You bowed when the reeve passed, not because he earned it, but because you couldn't risk not doing so. The cost of defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse. Banishment, starvation, debt passed to your children. Everyone knew someone who vanished. A cousin, a friend, a man who said no at the wrong time. You didn't forget them, but you couldn't follow them either. So you bent, you bartered, you found space in the cracks. You hid extra sacks of rye. You fed the poor from your own pot when no one was looking. You stole back your dignity and shared laughter and quiet acts of mercy. You weren't trying to change the world. You were trying to survive it without losing yourself. And in that survival, there was resistance. Not loud, not written in songs, but real. The kind of resistance that shows up in lullabies. In the way your daughter braided her hair the way your mother did. In the way you told stories by firelight about men who were kind and strong, not just powerful. In the way your hands planted what your grandfather once planted, hoping it would grow again. There were prayers for the dying. Quiet ones, murmured by flickering firelight. Words meant less for miracles than for comfort. So when the Black Death came, when it finally rolled over your land in the 14th century, it didn't surprise anyone. It horrified, yes, but not shocked, because by then, the people already knew what sickness could do. They'd seen it, lived through it. They just hadn't seen it this bad. You could wake up well and be buried before sunset. That wasn't new. It was just happening more often. The plague didn't whisper. It screamed. Buboes swelling like poisoned grapes under the jaw, under the arm. Fevers so fierce they burned away names. Blood turning thick and dark, leaking where it shouldn't. People didn't die in weeks anymore. They died in hours. Entire families, entire streets, entire villages. Gone. Not over time. All at once. You knew something was wrong when the bells rang too often. Then, not at all. When the sound of footsteps faded. When a cottage door stayed closed for too long. Some peasants tried to run. They packed what little they had and vanished. But disease travels faster than legs. It rode the wind. It clung to cloth. It sat in the curve of a borrowed spoon. You couldn't outpace it. Others turned to the church, doubled their prayers, whipped their backs bloody, swore they'd be better if only they were spared. Others turned to rage, blamed strangers, blamed Jews, blamed sinners, blamed anyone who was different enough to notice, anyone except the sky. The church kept speaking, offering comfort, offering meaning, offering burial. But even they weren't immune. Monks collapsed mid-hymn. Priests died with incense still in hand. In some places, the bodies came faster than the rites. The words ran dry. The ground filled too quickly. Graves went unmarked. Some were dug by those who knew they'd lie in them soon. And still, life didn't stop. It shifted. It shrank. But it didn't stop. People learned how to live alongside plague. They scrubbed with vinegar. They hung herbs. They whispered newer, stranger prayers. They passed garlic under pillows. They told themselves that if you survived once, you might be safe next time. Some believed, some didn't. It didn't matter. They all kept moving. They still milked cows, still fed chickens, still coaxed green from soil. They taught their children which mushrooms to avoid and which ones to boil 3 times. How to bind a wound, how to cool a fever, how to tell when someone would recover and when hope was just habit. And through it all, they didn't stop being human. They married. They had children. They harvested what the earth allowed. They shared what little they had. They sat by fires and told stories about the last time the sickness came. How someone's grandfather beat a winter illness with nothing but warm broth and a stubborn spirit. They said it with laughter, sometimes with tears, but they said it. That mattered. Plague wasn't an end. It was a rhythm, a terrible one, but part of the music now. And for those who made it through, every breath became a kind of protest. Every meal a defiance, every smile a refusal to vanish quietly. You learned not to count the dead aloud, not because you didn't care, but because counting made them heavier. And still, you remembered. Not always names, but the way someone stirred stew, the way someone sang to their goat, the way someone folded cloth with calloused fingers. They were remembered in details, not dates. The nights were never peaceful, even before the sickness. But after, they felt different. Not quieter, just emptier. A silence not from rest, but from absence. You heard your own heartbeat louder, your own breath in the rafters. You curled closer to firelight, not for heat, but for company. Darkness came earlier than it used to, or maybe it just felt heavier. There weren't candles to spare. Wax was worth more than wine. A tallow lamp might burn for prayer or for tending the dying, but not for comfort. So you let the fire sink low, watched the last embers turn to glow, and then you lay down. You didn't sleep like people do now. You slept in two parts. First sleep, a waking hour, second sleep. In between, you stirred the fire, whispered to God, checked the breathing beside you, thought about the stories you hadn't told. You didn't have clocks. You had rhythm and fear and muscle memory. The bed was shared, always, sometimes with too many. Family, neighbors, strangers taken in for mercy or debt. Sometimes even the goats. There were no lines drawn, just limbs tangled in habit. The rich had rooms, you had corners. You slept fully clothed, sometimes even in your boots. The cold didn't care about modesty. You heard the groans of sleep, the wheeze of breath, the prayer mumbled by someone half dreaming. You knew when someone was slipping, not by noise, by silence. You buried without ceremony sometimes, because there were no words left, because there was no time, because digging took energy you didn't have. Graves were shallow, markers were sticks, but you remembered. You always remembered. You bruise faster now. You wake with your hands curled, like they're still clutching tools long worn down or stolen by circumstance. The cold cuts deeper, not just in the fingers, but in the bones. It settles and stays. You tend the fire more than you ever tended meals. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed it even when your belly stays empty, because warmth, however slight, is still a gift you can give yourself. By now, you've eaten everything that once passed as food. The roots, the bark, the weeds you used to pull and toss aside, the dried peas too old to soften, the flour gone bitter in its barrel. You've boiled bones until they bled chalk into the water, boiled them again, and again. You've baked famine bread so dry and cracked, it cut your gums and chipped a tooth. And when even that failed, you turned to what wasn't food, but maybe, if squinted at kindly, could pass. Leather, boiled, salted, chewed until softened. Rats. If you found one, you didn't scream. You thanked God. You whispered his name and cooked it quietly, alone. You didn't share. You still feel ashamed of that, but you don't regret it. You were hungry, and hunger isn't moral. It just is. The dreams change. You don't dream of people anymore. You dream of feasts, of roasted meat, of warm loaves split open, of butter dripping down your chin. You wake chewing nothing but your own tongue. You dream of gardens in bloom, of summer fruit bursting from branches. You dream of animals returned, of fields grown green again. You dream of being full, and those are the worst, because they feel kind, until you wake. Then they break you. The graveyard grew in waves, slow at first, then sudden, then too fast to keep pace. You knew someone had passed, not because the bell rang, but because it didn't. Because no one had strength left to pull the rope. The graves were shallow, the prayers short, the mourning quiet. Not because you didn't grieve, but because you couldn't afford to. Sorrow was weight, and you were already carrying too much. And then, one day, the sky changed. Not in grand ways, just softer. The rain came and stayed, not as a flood, but as hope. The earth loosened. Seeds, forgotten or hoarded or prayed over, began to sprout. Green, pale, weak, trembling, pushed through brown. You didn't rejoice. You waited. But something inside you leaned forward. You gave the first harvest away, to the children, to the elders, to the sick. You took the smallest piece. You told yourself you weren't hungry. And when the first real loaf came from the oven, cracked on top, charred underneath, you stared at it. You held it like it was sacred. You remembered every trick, every bargain, every lie you told to keep someone else alive. and you ate it slowly, and it filled you, and you cried. By the time your legs were strong enough to run again, the church had already written you into its books, claimed your soul, named your days, not by your choosing, but by tradition, by structure, by the weight of inheritance. You didn't resent it. Not really. It was just there. A shadow that helped you see the shape of things. In the still hours, before the fire caught, after the shutters rattled, you could feel it in the walls. Not like a god exactly, but like a rule, a framework, a set of signs. The church was the line that ran through everything. It didn't exist beside your life. It wrapped around it. It told you when to kneel, when to fast, when to confess, when to bury. The priest, often the only literate man in town, became your clock, your calendar, your reluctant counselor. He knew the seasons. He knew the saints. He knew how to comfort and how to scold. He walked with robes that carried both comfort and warning. You brought him eggs. You told him your sins, even the ones you weren't sure were sins. You whispered your worries and hoped he'd nod kindly. He held the only guaranteed moments in your life, birth, marriage, and death. Everything else was uncertain. But those rights, they were yours. And he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved. Because love, as the sermons often reminded you, was obedience. Love meant kneeling even when you didn't understand. Latin poured over you like rain, cold, constant, and not meant to be questioned. You stood beside your family in the nave, your feet numb, your mouth echoing syllables you didn't comprehend. But you believed, or you tried to. You believed that something happened at the altar, that the bread wasn't just bread, that the wine carried something invisible, that the priest's hands were more than hands, and when he lifted the cup, you bowed your head. You didn't need to understand the words. They passed through you anyway, like music, like wind. You mouthed what you could. You hoped it was enough. Because the church wasn't just a place to pray. It was a place to belong. A net woven under your life, tight or fraying, depending on the season. It wasn't always fair. It wasn't always kind. But it was always there. And sometimes, in a world that changed so little and yet hurt so often, consistency was the only thing that felt like mercy. So you stay. You stay because the rhythm is familiar, even when it aches. You stay because the roof leaks in predictable ways. Because the stew is still warm, even if it's the same stew that's been warming for 3 days straight. Because you know exactly how many logs are left by the hearth and how many more you'll need before the week is over. You stay because in a world so often uncertain, familiarity is its own kind of safety. You wake with the sun, not because it's romantic, but because the light through the cracks in the shutters refuses to let you sleep longer. You rise with sore legs, with a back that protests before it stretches. You light the fire, fetch the water, patch what's broken. You speak to your neighbor, the same words as yesterday and the day before. It isn't exciting, but it is enough. You survive between dawn and dusk, between feeding the chickens and folding the wool, between mending fences and watching the wind push the sky into new shapes. News rarely travels here, not real news. What reaches you has passed through too many mouths, too many cups of cider, too many long pauses and forgotten details. A king might be dead, or crowned, or both. A war might be starting, or ending, or paused for winter. You hear about a comet that terrified a town a week's walk from here, and no one's sure if it's still in the sky. You shrug and go back to tending the fire. Time doesn't move in days or weeks. It moves in seasons. You don't say July. You say the week after haying. You don't know how old you are. You know how many harvests have passed since your brother left and didn't return. You know the year the barley grew thick and the geese nested early. You know the year the rye turned black and the well ran dry, and the old midwife died just before Easter. Those are your chapters. The steward visits sometimes. He writes things in a book you cannot read. He counts chickens. He asks questions you answer carefully. Never too much detail, never too little. You don't know where he goes afterward, but you suspect it's somewhere with better shoes. You've never seen the king. You don't expect to, but you know his name. You say it in prayers, because names matter in prayers, even if you're not sure why. Here, on the edge of the map, if there even is a map, you live a life so quiet it barely echoes. Change comes slowly, and when it does, it usually takes more than it gives. So you learn to cherish what doesn't move. The warmth of the hearth, the crooked shelf you've promised to fix but never do, the feel of your hands in the same soil your grandmother once turned with her own. Most of your walking is circular, from house to well, from well to field, from field to home, over and over. You've walked hundreds of miles in your life, but you've never left the valley. The next village is 5 miles away, and it might as well be 5 kingdoms. You've heard its name. You know someone who married someone from there. You've heard they bake better bread or raise meaner sheep, but you haven't gone. Why would you? Travel is dangerous, not in stories, in truth, in silence. in being alone too long in places where no one would look for you. The road isn't marked. There are no signs, only guesses. Walk until you see the crooked tree, then turn where the path dips. But what if the tree falls? What if the path is muddy? What if you never find the place they said you'd find? The forest is not a friend. It's beautiful from the edge, but step inside and the air thickens. The light changes. Roots trip you. Sounds move behind you. Wolves, maybe, or worse. Boars, or people with no names left, just hunger and sharp things. The forest doesn't care about prayers. And then there are the bandits. Men with no fields, no homes, no mercy. Men who see your worn boots and imagine coin inside them. Men who see a woman and imagine opportunity. The world beyond your village isn't filled with wonders. It's filled with risk. And so you learn not to wonder too much. You learn the names of every bend in the stream, every patch of moss between here and the chapel. You know who walks with a limp and who whistles badly, and who once claimed to have seen a fox turn into a man. You know these things, and you hold them like a map drawn in memory. The land is yours, not by law, but by living on it. You've built things, you've buried things, you've bled into it. That makes it yours. No one else would want it, not really. The soil is stubborn, the rains are late, the wind bends the trees wrong, but it's yours. And that's enough. Some dream of cities, of spires and markets and voices you don't recognize. You don't. You dream of quiet, of the fire catching on the first try, of a hen laying 2 eggs in one day, of a fence that doesn't need mending. That's your paradise. Not golden streets, just dry boots and full bowls. You don't need to go far to feel everything worth feeling. You've loved, you've feared, you've mourned. You've laughed until your ribs ached. You've watched a lamb be born. You've held someone's hand as they died. You've tasted the first strawberry of summer and the last crust of famine bread. You've seen the sky blaze pink and gold before rain. What more is there? So you stay. Not because you're afraid, but because you've built a life out of staying, out of knowing, out of keeping the fire going. Even when the world is cold. The nights were long, and the dreams, longer. You didn't dream of kings or angels. You dreamed of bread that didn't crumble, of shoes without holes, of fences that held against the wind. And sometimes, rarely, you dreamed of something bigger, something impossible, a different life, even if only for a heartbeat. But you never said it aloud. You stayed, because staying was safe, or as safe as anything could be. You knew the shadows in this place, the creak of the same floorboard, the way the smoke curled from the chimney when the fire caught right. And that was enough. You weren't seeking glory. You were seeking survival, and you were good at it. You had learned the rhythm, the slow bend of seasons, the way hope ebbed in winter and trickled back with thaw. You marked time in footsteps, in chores, in how many logs it took to warm the house each week. You counted blessings like lentils, one for warmth, one for quiet, one for no new graves. Change wasn't welcome here. It was feared. Because change, when it came violently. A lord replaced, a new tax levied, a soldier passing through with a sharp smile and louder hands. So you learned to love the stillness, even when it hurt, even when it dulled, because dull pain was better than sharp. You taught your children not to ask too much, not to wander, not to hope out loud. You taught them which berries to avoid and how to coax bread from barley. You taught them stories, too. Some old, some made up on the spot. Stories with small heroes and quiet victories, because that was what you knew. You kept secrets, little ones. A bundle of grain buried behind the shed. A wooden charm carved into the underside of a stool. A name you whispered only at night, when no one was listening. These weren't rebellions. They were reminders that you were still yours in some small way. You bartered when you could. You borrowed with apologies. You lent without asking for return. Not because you were generous, but because you knew how it felt to need. You knew that hunger didn't always wear a face. Sometimes it came as silence, as a bowed head, as an empty pot washed clean. And still, you hoped. Not every day, not even most days, but some days. When the bread rose higher than expected, when the sun stayed a little longer in the sky, when the lamb survived its first week, you let hope creep in, like warmth through stone. You lit candles even when wax was scarce. You knelt when the bells rang. You kissed your child's forehead and muttered blessings half remembered. You sang lullabies you barely understood the meaning of. But the melody mattered. It tethered you. There was no room for luxury, but you made space for beauty. In patterns scratched into wooden spoons, in flowers pressed between pages of books you couldn't read, in the way you braided your daughter's hair to look like your mother's. These were your cathedrals. Sometimes a stranger passed through, a traveler, a monk, a peddler with stories that sounded too bright to be true. You listened, you nodded, you smiled, but you didn't believe them, not really. Your world wasn't made of stories. It was made of tasks, of repetition, of weight. But still, when the traveler left, you watched the road longer than you meant to. You wondered what else might exist beyond that bend. You wouldn't go, but you allowed the wondering. That was enough. You weren't waiting for miracles. You were waiting for tomorrow, for the next loaf, the next thaw, the next planting. And sometimes, that waiting was its own kind of faith. So, when dawn came again and the sky cracked pale above the hills, you rose. You stretched your aching joints. You stirred the coals. You whispered a thank you weren't sure you believed. And then you began again. Because that was the only revolution you knew. To begin again. You stayed because someone had to. Because if you left, who would feed the animals? Who would mind the fence, patch the roof, lift the child? You stayed because the land needed hands, and yours were already callous to the task. You stayed because it was simpler to do the known work than to chase something uncertain across a distant horizon. And even if you had gone, even if your feet had itched enough to carry you over the next ridge, what then? A village not your own. Faces that squinted at your dialect, bread that tasted strange, rules you never learned, customs you never heard of, a wrong word, a wrong glance, and suddenly, you're unwelcome. Not because you meant harm, but because you didn't belong. So you stayed. You watched others go, usually the bold or the desperate. A young man with a sword and a plan, a girl too clever to be ignored, a widow with nothing left to lose. Some returned, some didn't. And when they didn't, people didn't ask why. They just said, he went past the trees. As if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Life here was small, but it was also whole. You weren't alone. Not really. You shared the mornings, the work, the aches. You shared stories about the same storms, the same arguments, the same goat that never stayed where it was tied. You lived side by side with people who knew your grandmother's laugh and your sister's limp, and the way your father used to squint when he lied. That was enough. You didn't need a castle to feel strong. You didn't need silk to feel comfort. You didn't need to see oceans to know the depth of sorrow. You knew it here, in this valley, in this field, in the eyes of a child holding too small a loaf, in the hands of an old man burying his last chicken, in your own chest, when you lay awake and counted the things you could not fix. You knew joy too, brief, sharp, stubborn. You knew the first bite of bread after a famine, the sound of your name said kindly, the warmth of a sunbeam in late spring, the moment the goat gave birth and both survived. You knew laughter, even if it came with tears, even if it came at the worst possible time, especially then. The world outside was full of promise and danger in equal parts, full of roads too long and maps you didn't have. But here was something you could build. Not just walls or meals or children, but a way of being, a way of rising each day, even when your knees protested, a way of tending what mattered, even when it felt too small to matter. Your days were shaped by chores, yes, but also by rituals, the way your mother hummed while grinding grain, the exact tilt of your father's hand when testing for rain, the way your own fingers moved without thinking, weaving, washing, lifting, mending. These were gestures older than your name, older than your house, passed down not in words, but in motion. And there was beauty, not the kind sung about by poets, but the kind that took root in repetition. A window patched with horn that still caught the light just right, a wooden spoon worn smooth by decades of stirring, the curve of a worn threshold, shaped by 1,000 footsteps, the crooked beam that held anyway. Even silence had weight here. The good kind. The kind that stretched across a room and meant understanding, not absence. The kind shared between people who knew each other's stories without needing them retold. The kind that wrapped around you when you sat by the fire, listening to nothing in particular. And if there was fear, you learned to carry it quietly, like a stone in your pocket. You didn't ignore it, you just didn't give it your name. You lit candles anyway. You sang anyway. You planted seeds anyway. Because fear didn't change the rhythm, only made it more fragile. So you stayed. Because the village was enough. It had conflict. It had illness. It had rot and rumor and nights so cold they cracked your nails. But it also had rhythm. The ring of the bell, the stretch of shadow at midday, the whisper of wheat against your legs, the way the earth always yielded, slowly, grudgingly, beautifully. And as the years folded over each other, as the ache settled deeper and the roof sagged lower, the world outside grew no closer. You didn't mourn it. You understood it now. Some people are meant to move. You were meant to stay. Your house isn't much, but it's yours. Built by hand. Your father's hands, your own, maybe your child's now. It leans like an old man in the wind. Each beam a memory, each patch a quiet compromise with time. The walls are daub and wattle, a marriage of mud and branches that was never meant to last forever, but has lasted longer than anyone expected. The roof sighs in the rain. Thatched straw laid down layer by layer, tied in tight bundles and pressed close against the beams. At first, it was golden. Now it's gray, patched with twine, with rags, with hope. You can tell where the rain will fall before the clouds do. There's a bucket in the corner, a cracked bowl near the hearth, a folded cloth above the bed. These things are not broken. They're just part of how the house breathes. There is no floor, not really. Just earth packed down by 1,000 footsteps. On dry days, it's solid. On wet ones, it remembers that it was once mud. You cover it with straw, or rushes, or nothing at all. You sweep it with a branch broom and pretend it stays clean. It doesn't. But that's not the point. There's no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters that groan when the wind comes through. They never quite close all the way. You stuff the cracks with wool or old linen. In summer, they stay open. In winter, they freeze shut. The air comes in regardless. So does the noise. The cows lowing, the chickens clucking, the distant hoot of something wild in the trees. You've learned to hear it all like background music. Familiar, harmless, mostly. The hearth is the center of everything, built of stone or clay, if you were lucky. A hole above it lets the smoke curl out mostly. Your eyes sting anyway. The walls are always a little sooty. The air inside always a little thick. The fire never really dies. You bank the coals at night, stir them in the morning, and breathe life back into it like it's a sleeping animal. It feeds you, warms you, reminds you that the house is still alive. You share the space, not just with your family, but with animals too. The cow sleeps in the corner, heavy and gentle. The goats mutter in their sleep. Chickens shuffle under the bench, clucking softly. The dog lies across the doorway, twitching in a dream. It's not ideal, it's not clean, but it's warm, and warm matters more than tidy. Everyone sleeps in the same room. Parents, children, cousins, the odd stray orphan or traveling relation. You've learned to sleep through snoring, through coughing, through whispered prayers, and restless limbs. You don't expect quiet. You expect presence, a shared breath, a shared blanket, a shared dream sometimes. There's no privacy, but there is comfort. You know the weight of your daughter's head on your arm, the rhythm of your partner's breath, the way your mother shifts in her sleep when the wind howls. These are your lullabies. Storage is everywhere and nowhere. A hook for herbs, a shelf for jars, a rafter lined with onions or apples wrapped in straw. A single chest holds your best things, if you have best things. A spoon carved smooth by years, a piece of lace from your grandmother, a cup with no handle but a perfect curve for your hand. You repair what you can. You ignore what you can't. The wall behind the hearth always leans. The door drags in the damp. The bench wobbles if you sit just so. But you know how to angle your body, where to put your weight, how to balance what's unbalanced. That's what living here teaches you, how to stay upright in something that was never quite built to stand. The smell of the house shifts with the seasons. In spring, it's wet earth and wool. In summer, smoke and sweat and cut grass. In autumn, onions, apples, damp leaves. In winter, it's animal breath and old fire, and the slow sour scent of stew that's been reheated too many times. You could follow the calendar just by scent. And the sounds. There are always sounds. A rafter groaning, a hen murmuring in her sleep, your son's soft cough, a creak that could be the wind or the wall or something in between. You learn not to fear it. Or rather, you fear it quietly, tucked away. The way you tuck kindling into the fire. Ready, but not urgent. Sometimes, the wind shakes the shutters so hard you think they'll break. Sometimes, the roof leaks so badly, you sleep with a cloth on your face. Sometimes the fire won't catch, and the cold presses in until your fingers forget how to move. But you stay, because this house, this imperfect, breathing, shifting house, is your world. It holds you. It remembers you. Every creak and crack is something you've earned. You don't dream of castles. You dream of dry nights, of full bellies, of the roof holding through the next storm. You dream of the floor staying solid, of the hearth catching flame on the first try, of no one coughing before dawn. This is your life. And it's not grand. It's not famous, but it's real. And you have made it through another day, another winter, another hunger, another ache. You bank the fire. You pull the blanket up. You listen to the rain on the roof and the breath of the people beside you. And you sleep, not in luxury, but in knowing. You made it home again.